Okay, everybody, the serious thing. John said to me, it looks a bit jolly, your title. It's unlike you. Or is it? Normally it's a bit plainer than that, but I had someone say to me who was going to come tonight and I haven't seen her here. I do like your talks, not like them very often, but they're always quite light-hearted. So I thought I'd make it light-hearted. But actually, as you'll go through my talk, you'll see it's not light-hearted at all. Some of it is, but it actually ends in quite a sort of manner which you'll see as time goes on.
Oh, do you want backlights out?
Yes, please. Thank you, Jan. My grandmother, bless her soul, kept a scrapbook. It's not a diary, it's a scrapbook. She cut out and pasted items from local newspapers, but she also wrote many things in there. And I have actually spoken before from the scrapbook, but it's also her mother's. So we're going back to Victorian times. And believe you me, I've got a lot more to come from this after tonight. So I hope you'll enjoy this. Okay, first of all, I'd just like to show you how the Gilligans fit in with the Cook family, because the Cook family were in Auburn from, if I can get it to work.
What's going on? What's going on?
Sorry, folks.
Sorry. Yeah, you take that away. Wait a minute.
That's it.
Now it's working.
Okay. This is the Cook family tree in Auburn from 1672, and John's got me back quite a bit further than 1672 on the Cook side of it, on the female line, but it's difficult to show how far back you can go on female line, but certainly with Cooks, they go back to 1672 because there's a marriage in 1672. And if you look down the right-hand side, the families go down to Gilligan's in 1914. Paddy, my grandfather, you can see it, can't you? You'll just have to believe me then. Paddy married my grandmother in 1914, and the Cooks actually were a very successful building company for hundreds of years, literally hundreds of years, and they operated from Marlborough House, which is opposite the post office. Certainly before the Enclosure Act, because we've got them in the Enclosure Act, and they've been there for a long time then. But one side of the family actually went to Reading, Jim Cook. I'll show you him in a minute. And he became mayor of Reading. So they did quite well. But my grandmother was the last of the Cooks in Auburn, and then she became a Gilligan. So that's where the Gilligans started off. My grandmother married Paddy, who was already a successful Irish jockey from Dublin. But he thought he'd come over to England to seek his fortune, which he sort of did by coming to Auburn. Auburn at that time was the top of the table, top of the tree with racing stables. I'd just like to go back further though. Here is a book which was given to the Cook family in 1816. And it's a very early drawing of the church and courthouse. We've used it actually in Heritage Centre, but I've actually got the book that was given by the daughter of a vicar who actually was a vicar in Auburn. And it was a way of saying thank you, because these sort of books were hard to come by and they cost a lot of money. Another thing that was in my grandmother's scrapbook was this. This is at a time when fisticuffs hadn't become unlawful, but there was a huge movement to get it made against the law. And this poster appeared in Auburn about a fight in Hungerford. And it's very, very Bible thumping, actually, if you read it. Can you read it? I haven't got it here either tonight, but it's very fragile bit of paper, actually. I've got it at home. But it's just interesting that the family felt that it was of sufficient importance to keep it. Another thing from early on in the family archive in my grandmother's scrapbook was this. Now, Broome Witts, the Witts family owned the fustian factory in South Street. And Broome Witts was one of the main owners of the Witts factory. And this was an invoice that the Cook family had from 1835. And I haven't got that here tonight. Again, it's very fragile, but I have got it at home. It's just an interesting paper from 200 years ago. We know definitely the Witts owned the fustian factory. We knew anyway, but you know, evidence. Now back to my grandmother. She would keep a recipe book, receipt book, as she called it, which is here. And in it, she would write recipes. I mean, she's about 10. When was she born? Late 1870s. So she was 9 or 10 when she wrote this. And Christmas cake. But it's what they did. They didn't have television or radio. Here's an early picture of Marlborough House, about 1905. It's a well-known picture, but it's in her scrapbook. You'll see that along the side of Marlborough House, there's a lot of wood put against it. They were carpenters and builders, so it was a working place. And my brother would tell you that before they pulled it all down, knocked it back, there was a pit, a saw pit, which is filled in from rubbish, probably still there. The front bit of it, bit at the front, was a paint shop. It was later to become an animal foods place, a corn shop, and then later on still it's become a cycle shop, and you'll see that in a minute, which is that one. That's what it was 30 years later. You'll see the all the baskets hung up around the outside. There's shovels and forks and spades. It's the same sort of angle from the other one, but it's just a bit further back along West Street, as you can see. I was saying about my grandfather, Paddy, who married my grandmother in 1914. He was already well known when he came to Albourne, but he got better. He actually rode in Germany for a couple of years, but came back to marry Mary, my grandmother. And during the war, he went to Gallipoli and in the Royal Veterinary Corps, because he was a jockey, jockeying horses. And here he is, a picture of him at the Windsor Races in 1917. You can see his royal armband. He was actually a jockey for the King, King George V, for a bit. Going back a year before that, though, my mother and Paddy's first house was in Castle Street, or Wimbury House, just up on the first corner of Castle Street on the left. And that's an envelope that we've got. My great-grandfather was Donald Cook, who was a well-known and popular builder. That's him in the middle on his golden wedding anniversary, 1916. He married a lady called Elizabeth Palmer, whose father, Joseph, worked in the Bell Foundry in the early 1820s. And her sister, married Donald Cook's brother. So there was two brothers married two sisters. My grandmother is on the very right-hand side of the picture, holding her first baby. Paddy is on the right-hand side at the top. On the very far left-hand side of the picture, you'll see Great Aunt Alice, who looks to me around about 16 years. She is about 16 there. And when she was 10, She appeared in the village play called The Village Wedding. And that's my great-grandfather, Donald Cook, just after marrying Elizabeth in, that's 1870, 4 years after they got married. I do know, but let me tell you about this one next. 6 years after this photograph was taken, now this is my grandmother here with her baby, who was born in 1915. This. Hattie's and her daughter, who was then 7. Yeah, she fell from swing and contracted lockjaw and died. And there's her grave in the churchyard. You'll see her name at the bottom. Donald Cook, my great-grandfather, he died very shortly after Eileen died, heartbroken. And that's when my grandfather and my grandmother moved into Marlborough House. My auntie, my father's sister, Auntie Peggy, when she was 10 or 11, she drew this. There was no census in 1921, just after the First World War. That was much later. So Auntie Peggy took herself to draw a map of the village. And it's been very useful to this map to us. I'm sorry it's a bit blurred. I've tried to push it all together because it's in 4 parts, actually. I've tried to squeeze it all together. It does tell us who lived in what house and what their occupations were. And it is interesting because some of the names are very familiar, like the Barneses in the grocery shop, Powell in the stables, and in the butts, there's 2 names. 2 people lived together. One was by the name of Barnes and the other by the name of Pizzy. And for their occupation, she put layabouts. I don't know whether she made this map very public or not. Anyway, moving on. Of course, the war was looming in 1939, but before that, King George V celebrated his silver coronation. And there's a celebration program that there were races in the village, a sports day in the village was held, and there's a coronation badge that grandmother had. And in the war, Paddy was an ARP, warden, and my grandmother was in the voluntary service, women's voluntary service. There are some recipes that grandmother kept, and I've got a book here that shows these recipes. Mostly printed, these are. But it's just interesting from the time. Now, we're talking about 80 years ago. And in 1946, just after the war, Paddy died in 1946, and there's a family photograph of my grandmother in the middle. She looks as though she's had a shock. Behind her is my mother. Yes, my mother. And to her right, on the left is my father. And I said about the 16-year-old girl in the photograph just now. Well, to the left of my father, on the end, at the top, is her, 30 years later. Now then, just 1 or 2 little things. I've nearly finished, actually. But do anyone here know Melanie Locke? Her family lived at Woods End. Melanie was a very good singer and dancer. In fact, she became a professional singer and professional dancer. And my grandmother, who was she trained to be a concert pianist, took piano lessons, and Melanie was her star pupil. And Melanie won all sorts of awards, and she's still alive. She lives in Bristol, actually, and we had some correspondence some time ago at the Heritage Centre, I think. And this one will make you smile, I hope. Who's the little boy? Yeah, of course. The importance of this photograph is the fact that it shows how Carnival Queens were chosen. They weren't chosen exactly, they had sold tickets. And in this photograph, it tells you that Margaret Leighton, who's actually knelt down, you can't see her very well, but she's been crowned. She sold 900 and something tickets. And the lady holding the train, the further one on the right, is Marion Mildenhall. And the one this side is Pam Pettick, who died not too long ago. Yeah. And it also says about Posy of Flowers was given to Lady Scott by Angela Palmer, who lives in Palmer's Field. In the good bungalow, Palmer's Field, Angela lives there. Another cutting that my grandmother had was this one. Auburn bandsmen received awards. They were made life members of the National Band Club in 1953. Now, I wonder if Gavin would know whether this clipping has actually been, is it in the band archive or not, but we'll talk about that. But my grandmother thought this was important enough to keep in her scrapbook. Tommy Barnes, of course, is one of the starter Barnes coaches. You remember me telling you about Eileen, who died? Not sure, that's her grave, okay? This is today's family grave. And this is a little oil lamp that I found when I was cleaning the grave when Mother was interred 5 years ago. And it seems that my grandmother and grandfather kept a vigil with this little oil lamp. You see this little oil lamp? And they would keep vigil at the foot of Eileen's grave, which is just the one upright then. And it's obviously got left there, but yeah, I've recovered it. How about that? So there you go. That's it for now. When we finish this evening, when we're having coffee, I've got some bits and pieces here you might like to have a look at. And I have my grandmother's diary here, and there's a picture of Paddy when he was corporal in the war, sergeant in the war. With medals there and that, and there's 2 or 3 bits. I might just like to have a look at it. Okay. Anyway, that's it, folks. And I'll now pass on to John, who is going to tell you a bit about how the next subject, Eric Jones, fits into my family as well, which I didn't know. Eric always told me we were cousins, but John will tell you how.
Right. Early in February this year, I had an email which came to me from Eric Jones, who many of you may remember as one of our members who used to come here regularly to these meetings. But ever since COVID, ever since the lockdown, he and Sylvia have preferred to keep in touch with us through Zoom. So they've been present for all of our meetings, but we haven't necessarily seen them. I had this email arrive from Eric. It says, "Dear John, I'm attaching a note, which I hope you will read for me at the next November's members meeting. I shan't be driving myself on an autumn night, and you do seem to be soliciting contributions." And that email was attached a short paper with the outline of the talk that he wanted me to give. So I emailed back to him and said, yes, of course I would do that. Sorry that he didn't feel he was going to be able to do it himself, but I'd be in touch later in the year to get some more information for him to fill out the talk so that we could complete it. Sadly, 3 weeks later, we got an email from Sylvia to say that Eric had passed away. But I'm going to keep to my word with Eric and do the best that I can with information which has come from the family and from friends, and information that I've found out myself as well to fill out what Eric says. But mostly I'm going to read what Eric actually wrote. He starts off, my ancestors came to Wiltshire from a country house in South Wales in the 1530s. They were late members of the Taffia, opportunists who in their case were returning to England after some centuries, pillaging the Welsh and intermarrying with them. And this next bit he often spoke about, but I never got to the bottom of. Their history in that respect closely parallels that of the Cromwells, aka Williamses, with whom they also later intermarried. They came to Minol, 4 miles from Albourne, renting land and the rabbit warren from the Hungerfords, premier sheep farmers in the county. And from that start, they added holdings of their own. Well, what I have been able to find is a printed version of the lease, or at least details of the lease, which William Jones had from Sir Walter Hungerford. And this is from a survey of Minol that was done on the first year of Queen Elizabeth, 1585. And the Lord of the Manor was Sir Walter Hungerford. And the survey reported that William Jones claimeth to hold, for the term of his life, of the grant of Sir Walter Hungerford, knight, by indenture made to John Jones, his father, deceased, and to him the said William and Stephen Jones, his brother. So the original lease was for a lease for 3 lives. Dated on the feast of St. Michael the Archangel, Anno Cedo Elizabeth Regina. That's 1559, the first year of Queen Elizabeth. And they leased all that Warren Lodge and the game and slaughter of the conies lying in the parish of Minol. So they took the lease of the Warren of Minol. Called by the names of Burridge, and with all and singular the appurtenances of the same belonging, paying the yearly rent of 400 couple of conies. So the rent they had to pay was 800 rabbits a year, and it goes on as to where they should deliver them, and if Sir Walter is within 30 miles of Minol, then they have to deliver them themselves, otherwise he has to pay for the delivery. And it goes on to warn them not to make sure that the rabbits do not damage. Keep hitting the wrong key. Do not damage sound copse or thicket copse, or another copse that I wasn't able to find on the map. But if you look, here is sound copse, here is thicket copse, and up here in the corner, here's Minol down here, you can see. and the road going off towards Ramsbury and Axford. But here's Minal, and up here, about a mile or so north of Minal itself, is Woodland Farm. And that was the seat of the Jones family in Minal for several hundred years. And we'll see them in several other documents referring to Woodlands as being their estate. Eric went on. The chief entrepreneur was William Jones, a pushy and litigious fellow who acquired half a dozen manors at the end of the 16th century and makes brief appearances in Wiltshire records. William had a large family, and I have managed to trace several of his daughters and granddaughters who married into the royalist gentry. Now, half his family is marrying the Cromwells and the parliamentarian side, and he's got another lot of daughters and granddaughters marrying the royalists. They soon vanish, however. Unfortunately, he goes on, through taking their husband's surname. You never tell quite why people vanished in the time of the Civil War. But they took their husband's surnames, and Eric has obviously not followed them through. He tells us that William, what was it he says back here? William had a large family. Well, there were two Williams. There was William the Elder and William the Younger. And William the Younger died before William the Elder, but only by a couple of years. And William the Younger had 3 children, and William the Elder had 13, all being produced at the same time. So the family tree of the Jones family round about that time, the end of the 1500s, is very complicated. And I'm afraid without Eric's 30 years of investigation into it and access to his notes, I wasn't able to take it any further than that. So that was something that perhaps I might have been able to bring down to the present otherwise. There are close to 200 references to the Joneses in the Minal registers, all the way from the 1530s right the way through into the late 1600s and into the 1700s. Oh, I'm losing the cursor again. There are also a series of wills. As well as looking at the registers at Mindel, I also looked for wills for the Jones family and found several. I found, there we are, there are 2, William Jones the Elder and William Jones the Younger. Their wills are in the National Archives in Kew, and they're followed by 2 things which I've never come across before. Sentences given out by the probate court, the prerogative court of Canterbury. Unfortunately, they're very long documents and they're all in Latin. And so I've not actually gone into them. I'm sure that Eric did. What they show is that there was some kind of family dispute over the wills of one of the Williams, and I haven't worked out whether it was the Younger or the Elder, and also their father, John. There was a dispute over those wills, and these recorded sentences are the decisions of the court as to what should happen. Martha, who comes along, dies in 1629. She's the widow of William the Elder. And she has interesting information in her will. Those 2 earlier wills had a lot of family history information in them. And we come on finally to 1670. There's another will of John Jones, which I looked at eagerly, expecting to find just as much family history information, and there was none at all. because it seems that he didn't have any family, because the only people he mentioned in his will were his servants, who he left various amounts of money to. But his will was quite interesting, because here it is in the ledger of the Prerogative Court of Canterbury. And I've looked at these wills in those ledgers for 20 years and more, and I have never seen an initial capital quite so decorated as that. I can just imagine some young scribe on his first day at work saying, well, I shall show them just what an artist I am. And his boss seeing him later in the afternoon and saying, what are you doing, wasting time? We don't do letters like that. We do perfectly plain letters, because nobody's going to read this. So I'm quite amused by those, by this gentleman's work, those few days that he wrote these capitals. Back to what Eric has to say. Tracing any connection to Albourne is harder still, because in the 16th and 17th centuries, my own line featured 4 Edwards in succession. Well, I found 3 of them. I can't find the 4th one. Moreover, the Albourne Joneses retained their links with Minor and Marlborough parishes by going home to find wives, thus often taking themselves beyond the reach of Albourne registers. Registers to the Joneses in John Diamond's tree lines are therefore fragmentary, nor is there much trace of their occupations or occupation. Well, I'm sorry about that, but it's not in the registers. So. But here are just a snippet of the, there are actually 100 references to Joneses in our registers. But this is a family which is quite important to Eric, because here is his 4 times great-grandfather marrying and having children, and unfortunately his wife dying here. Sarah dies. Looks as though it's immediately after her daughter has been baptized, so it looks as though it's a complication of childbirth. But Sarah dies, and very shortly afterwards, Edward marries again. He seems to like the name Sarah, so he marries Sarah Stone. They have various children, one of whom is Stephen here, who is Eric's 3 times great-grandfather. And Edward, who's got married up here, finally dies in 1813, and the vicar, as we'll see later, tells us that he was 85 years old. Carrying on from Eric, I think some of William Jones's sons became gamekeepers, which at the time was acceptable for the sons of the lesser gentry. Over time, they tumbled down the social scale to the status of labourer, which was indeed a status rather than an occupation. There's Eric talking as an academic, and that has been his subject for many years. Agriculture in rural England and indeed rural Europe. Here we have examples of that. We've got the 1861 census, which is John Jones, and you can see he's referred to as a gamekeeper. His son Alfred marries in 1868, and both Alfred and his father are again referred to as gamekeepers. This is in Ashbury, both of those. And then in 1881, Alfred, who's now moved to Long Parish near Andover, is still working as a gamekeeper. So yes, indeed, we found plenty of references to gamekeepers in Eric's immediate line. Eric carries on back to William Jones. He seems to take an inordinate amount of notice of what I talk about, but John Diamond's talk in February 2022, Good Manners, Bad Manners, mentioned a case brought in 1600 against the Waldrons by a Sadler, a Warneford, and William Jones gentleman, who was surely one of mine. They were tenants of the Waldrons and objected to the intensive farming methods being introduced. Well, actually, not only are they his, but I'm not sure whether it's the younger or the elder, but it's back to one of those two Williams, is the William Jones gentleman. And I'm not sure whether I was a bit ambiguous in my talk or whether Eric has misunderstood, but actually John Sadler, William Warneford and William Jones, they weren't the plaintiffs in the case. They were actually the great and the good of the locality who'd been commissioned by the surveyor of the, actually I can go on to there, by the surveyor for the Duchy of Lancaster to come to Aldbourne to hear the case and to hear the arguments. But that was the case, and indeed that is, as I say, the William Jones, that's one of the two, either the elder or probably the elder, who's trying that case here. As to the Joneses as gamekeepers, Eric goes on, Joseph Betty in the Wiltshire Record Society publication of 2005 prints the family's Minor farm accounts and additionally cites a London poulterer deposing in 1624 that he had fetched some conies from the warren at Aldbourne Chase, from Edward Jones, a keeper near Aldbourne. And I can't find the accounts in that book. I've been through that book several times, and although there are accounts, what I have found is the lease that we looked at earlier, and also this story of the conies. And that basically was a case brought by the Crown in the Exchequer Court against John Bailey of Reading, who was a wholesale buyer of rabbits and other game. He also had a retail shop in Reading, and he was charged with illegally buying and reselling game from royal properties, especially from Aldbourne Chase. And if you remember others of my talks, when there's an investigation, a court case like that, the lawyers draw up a list of questions called interrogatories, which have to be put to each of the witnesses who come. And so there's a list of interrogatories, and then it tells us that William Long of Long Lane in the parish of St. Sepulchres in London, who's a poulterer aged 30 years and upwards, he was sworn and examined. And to the third interrogatory, the third question, he saith that he did begin to fetch conies from Maximilian Deacon and John Gilbert of Aldbourne Chase in the county of Wilts. And so he continued from that time till it was Twelvetide, which is 12th day after Christmas, the 6th of January, after. And this deponent bought twice in a week, weekly sometimes, 1 horse load and sometimes 2 horse loads, and sometimes more and sometimes less, under the said Bailey's house in Reading. And he did also fetch some from Edward Jones, a keeper near Aldbourne, and hath also received conies at Aldbourne brought from Lydiard. That was the case I sent to you, Karen, which he brought to the said Bailey's house for him, and also from the keeper of St. Francis Jones' warren at Ramsbury. What that book does not record is what the result of it was. The decisions of the courts are always held separately and very, very difficult to trace.
John, can I just ask, was this because the rabbits were poached and not good?
The suggestion is that they were illegally, that certainly the ones from Auburn should never have come on the market because they were royal ones.
Joneses had paid their 800 ponies rent. Weren't they at liberty to sell the rest of them?
Yeah, yes, I'm being asked about the legality of Edward Jones selling the rabbits. The Edward Jones bit is probably quite proper because he once he had paid his rent for his warren, he's then free to sell and make money from the rest of the rabbits. So I suspect that the problem isn't Edward Jones. The problem is those that have been coming from Auburn Warren. Back to Eric. Note too that a Thomas Jones, son of Edward and Elizabeth, was christened in Auburn in 1646, and another Thomas, probably his son, married an Anne Gremmet of Stock Close, Auburn, in 1686, with the unexpected side note that the marriage took place in Marlborough St. Peter, and the Grammets seem not to appear elsewhere. Well, here we are. Here is Thomas Jones being baptized. And here is the marriage entry from the record of St. Peter. And Eric is, I'm not sure about seem not to appear elsewhere. They do actually, but not very many of them. This is the complete list of all of the Grammet register entries in Wiltshire. And it's only about 20 of them. And if you notice that they're all clustered around Marlborough and Savernake, Burbage, Milton Lilbourne, Ramsbury, and so on. There's only a couple from the rest of the county. So it was a local name, but there didn't seem to be many of them. I will refrain from rehearsing the scrappy mentions of the Jones names until we come to the Edward, who was born in Marlborough in 1729. He's the fourth of the four Edwards. And it's the first one I've not been able to trace. The landowning Jones family of Ramsbury raised my hopes because they also had a son born that year, but he died in infancy. Joneses are always hard to disentangle, but the rule of thumb is that any local 18th century Jones who was rich and literate was not my kin. And anyway, here is Edward's record. He would have called it, or his parents would have called it 1728. But of course, that's under the old Julian calendar, where the date changed on the 25th, the year changed on the 25th of March. So we would call it 1729. My Edward Jones lived until 1813, when his burial in Aldbourne attracted a note by the incumbent about his advanced age of 85. We've already noticed, seen that. Edward was already on the parish, and the Joneses began their long descent of the social scale. He had married firstly an Aldrich, presumably the blacksmith's family, and secondly a Stone, a Marlborough family, I think. And his son Stephen, my three greats grandfather, was born in Aldbourne in 1777, moved to Baden, and from there as a keeper to Ashbury, where he married in 1800. And I've managed to follow that through. Here he is being baptized in 1777. Oh. Oh, okay. I think maybe my head is bouncing forward a couple of. If I look back, you might notice right here at the top, I left out a few words. The incumbent did something about his advanced age. The words I left out were a note by the incumbent, Thomas Pruin, Edward Jenner's disagreeable friend, about his advanced age. And that, I pricked my ears up at that remark. Thomas Pruin, who I knew was our curate from about 1812 to 1817, a friend of Edward Jenner. Could he mean the Edward Jenner? This meant that we should look a little further. So I did, and Googled Thomas Pruin, Edward Jenner. And I came to this from the Wellcome collection. The Wellcome collection is well known. The Wellcome Institute, the Wellcome collection, a charity for medical history and medical research. And so their collection is world famous as a medical historical collection. And they have a group of correspondence and papers of the Reverend Thomas Pruin relating to Edward Jenner. Not only do they have something well over 100 documents in that correspondence collection, but a lot of them are actually online. And so here we are. We find a letter from Edward Jenner to Thomas Pruin, where he's thanking him for some wood pigeons that have been sent in one direction and promising a pheasant would be sent back in return. And telling Pruin that actually Mrs. Jenner is really quite ill because she's finally developed a cold which involves spitting blood, which he doesn't seem terribly concerned about. And you'd think as a doctor at that time, he might be more concerned about his wife and what that might mean. But anyway, there are a load of documents there at the Wellcome Institute and possibly in other places. But the other thing which I found out was that Thomas Pruin was one of the people who acted as what in 1829, what in 2029 we might refer to as an influencer. And he wrote a book, the first book that explained and encouraged people to make use of the advances that Edward Jenner had made in vaccination. And he wrote a book, along with various other books actually, a comparative sketch of the effects of variolous and vaccine inoculation, being an enumeration of facts not generally known or considered, but which will enable the public to form its own judgment on the probable importance of the Jennerian discovery. They don't write titles for books like that anymore, do they? And sure enough, we can have a neatly reprinted facsimile copy sent to us leather bound, if we wish, from India for about 30 quid. But he also wrote various other books, including one of the early primers on chess. Eric goes on. Edward was already on the parish as the Joneses began their long. Oh, there we right. Ah. That's why I was confused before. I'd somehow managed to get this slide in two different places. I think I meant to move it and forgot to delete one of them. Right. Okay, here we are. So yes, this is Edward. And here he is marrying Sarah Aldrich in Aldbourne. And Sarah dying in 1770, just 6 years later, after the birth of their second child. And then within a year, Edward is marrying Sarah Stone. And then along comes Stephen. And Stephen goes off to Ashbury via Bishopston, it has to be said, because Stephen was actually born in Bishopston. He was baptized in Aldbourne, but he was born in Bishopston. And moved from there as a keeper to Ashbury, where he married in 1800. And unfortunately, Berkshire Record Office is not as generous with its registers as Wiltshire. And so I've had to rely on a transcription from Ancestry for the marriage of, we can see up here, Stephen Jones and Elizabeth Johnson down here. And they were married in Ashbury. It was one of Stephen's sons, John, who revived the Aldbourne connection by marrying in 1836 Jane Cook, who'd been born in 1815, a daughter of Thomas and Charlotte Cook at Aldbourne. This Thomas was a carpenter, and he and his wife died quite young. And here we are again, this is in Ashbury. So I don't have the original from the register, I just have the transcription. And there is John Jones of this parish. And Jane at the time was obviously, although she came from Aldbourne, was obviously living over in Ashbury, because she's also mentioned as being of this parish. Through the Cooks, my relationship to Aldbourne continues, notably in the person of my fifth cousin, Terry Gilligan. Much of the earlier story is, of course, surmise. I know how thorough Eric was, and I'm sure that most of it was not surmise. And I shall be grateful to anyone who can help fill in the yawning gaps. And here we are. Here is the link between Eric, who's down here, and Terry, who's there. And we follow Eric's line back through his parents, his grandparents, great-grandparents, second great-grandparents, and then, as he told us, his third great-grandparent, his second great-grandparent was John Jones, the son of Stephen, who's married Jane Cook. And if we come back the other side, Terry has told us how the Gilligans married into the Cook family. And that runs back until we get to Thomas Cook, who is both Eric and Terry's 4 times great-grandfather. Hence, they are fifth cousins. So that's the end of what Eric asked me to talk about. But I'm just going to take a few words to talk about Eric. Because he was just such a good friend of our organization. And such a good friend to me as well, I'll come to that. He was born in Andover in 1936. His father was Lionel, his mother Beatrice. His father was in 1939, he's in the 1939 register as a foreman motor mechanic. And Eric studied at Nottingham University. He gained doctorates, a Doctor of Philosophy and Doctor of Literature from Oxford. And he was a professor. I knew he was a professor, but I never guessed that he was a professor in universities across 3 continents. He was a professor at Northwestern University in the United States. He was a professor of La Trobe University in Melbourne in Australia. And he was professor at the University of Buckingham. Oh, hang on. Oh, what's happening? I didn't mean to do that. He was also a fellow of Nuffield College. But at heart, he was a naturalist. He has been a passionate bird watcher since he was 10. He was also an author. I've found over 20 books of his that he wrote. The 3 that are highlighted, The European Miracle, Growth Recurring, and Cultures Merging, are 3 books which gave him an international reputation and renown, and resulted in him lecturing across the world in his, I'm not the right person to try to explain it, but as I understand it, basically his premise was that national and international economies and growth are derived as much from the work of agriculturalists as the farmers, and as farming improved and life in the countryside improved, so that had benefits for the work, for the nation as a whole and continents as a whole. That agrarian progress was just as important as anything geopolitical. So he was a professor for the little man, I think. The 2 in red are books which we have in our collection. There's the book which he wrote with Patrick Dillon, who's one of the people I have to thank for helping me with some of the material for this, on the Middle Ridgeway and its environment. And it's an ode almost to the landscape of the Middle Ridgeway, through the Marlborough Downs and across towards the Chilterns. And also a small earthquake in Wiltshire, which is a story of the little-known Penruddock uprising against Cromwell during the interregnum, when a group of local yeomen, basically, including some of the Joneses, basically rebelled and captured the city of Salisbury before the Parliament's army could do anything about it. But it didn't last very long. I might give a talk about it based on Eric's books sometime in the next few years. It also talks about how members of his family were involved in the escape of Prince Charles from the country at the time of the Civil War. But as I say, Eric was a naturalist and he was an artist. And there he is in typical garb with his binoculars and his camera, or even more typically, with his sketchbook. Sylvia tells me he's left dozens upon dozens of sketchbooks, every one that he's produced since he was a teenager. And I know Liz and I have met one of his great friends. They've been friends since the age of 10, and bird watching friends. And at the age of 10 started putting together annual scrapbooks of the birds which they'd seen and things which they'd learned about, all of which they still have. And these wonderful scrapbooks put together by these two young lads. Actually, Eric's first publication was an article he wrote about the mating habits of the nuthatch. And he wrote that when he was a teenager, and he published it in a magazine when he was a teenager. And he was a wonderful artist of wildlife as well. And he was a brilliant person to be with. I wish I'd asked him more questions. That's it.